thinking about what you're counting on, and if you have money saved, then looking into alternatives rather than just dollars or treasuries, because Main Street, Wall Street, safe haven is, in my opinion, the opposite of safe.
Thanks for watching this RTD interview. Don't forget to pick up your RTD Scary George round, only available at sdbullion.com. Now enjoy this interview. Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have first-time guest, Mr. Chris Marcus of economist.com. Today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the financial markets, the overall economy, and just a variety of subjects in general. So Chris, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Michael, appreciate you having me on here. Certainly fascinating times in the world, and a good time to be rethinking the dollar.
Very much so. I do agree, and I appreciate you taking time to sit out here and join us. And so before we get into a couple of questions, I want to just basically open up, for those that may not know who Chris Marcus is, can you give us a little bit of information as to how you've arrived at this current point in your career in discussing markets and the economy and things of that nature?
Sure. I guess it goes back about a decade and a half ago. I graduated from Wharton's Business School, was trading equity options when the subprime bubble hit, which I think changed a lot of perspective for many folks. And certainly I found it odd how no one seemed to have seen it coming. I found it even more odd how I was like, wait a second, aren't I the guy who's conceivably went through the training and should have seen this? As we know now, business school, Wall Street kind of like directs you to look a very different perspective. But actually I got one of Peter Schiff's, a couple of his videos, started learning about Austrian economics, which it was incredible how instantly it all made sense as opposed to the Wall Street view that I'd been indoctrinated with to some degree that never quite added up. So I really started studying precious metals back in 2009, really looking at the way this dollar infrastructure is set up. Again, Austrian economics is life-changing and it's beautiful in its simplicity, where just for the same reasons that in Ben Bernanke's op-ed back in 2010 before QE2, he talked about all the virtuous effects of printing money, but did not mention that you would naturally get somewhat of the opposite when you retract it, which to me, I guess early on left me feeling rather comfortable with gold and silver, because especially as you've inflated these new bubbles, you have this dynamic where it's either A, you can continue to print, which I believe is ultimately what they'll do.
All right. So that leads to my next question. And so I typically start off, usually with the first question is, what comes to mind when Chris Marcus hears the words rethinking the dollar?
I think I'm pretty darn grateful that there are folks like you out there doing that and pointing these things out, because in the same way I understandably saw people who were ticked off 2008, 2009 when they got clobbered by following the advice of mainstream and Wall Street, that it's a darn important time to be rethinking what we think of as money and currency, because the dollar, you and I talked about a little bit today before we started, where all these other, what is the track record over a long term of all paper currencies? I don't think there's a single one that's yet survived. So that's already not happened. Then you look at what's being done with the dollar. I'm blown away by Dr. Mark Skidmore, who actually set out to disprove. He wasn't going looking for missing money from the Pentagon. He heard these numbers and thought, "Wait, this is, you can't lose." I think it was $6 trillion back then. And then as he went to investigate, he kept asking, where is this money gone? He's up to 21 trillion. I hear there are folks who think it's bigger than that, which that's what we've found. How many dollars are out there? If the Fed's really telling us an honest answer, that would be one of the few things I feel they've been honest about. So certainly I think for people who are dependent on the dollar in a world where we're launching trade wars against basically every country, which it's interesting on top of just the trade war. I mean, these are a lot of foreigners who are buying treasuries. What's nice about it is no one has to take your word, Michael. They don't have to take my word, but if somebody can figure out how, with deficits exploding faster than ever, we're already in historic territory in debt, and now we're printing I mean, God only knows how much is being printed. So I do think it's an important time, whether people like metals or cryptos or for each person, but seeing that there is something that, as far as I can see in my 18, 20 years in finance, is a matter of when rather than if at this point.
Right. I would agree. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things happening right now, but you'll be surprised at how many people will probably say the dollar is going to always be here. It's the world reserve currency, and, the dollar is king, and all those, old phrases and adages that's been used for decades now are being tested in a lot of ways, because there's new concepts such as de-dollarization and selling treasuries and all types of things going on now. But, from Arcadia economic standpoint, what are some things that you probably focus on more than others? Are there any things that really have you concerned in this current monetary financial world we're in?
Well, I think you just nailed one of them. Yeah, we can dig into any particular asset, but for folks sitting at home and listening and, hearing, hopefully some of what we're saying is making sense, but then they go back and turn on CNBC and they're like, how it just doesn't, jive, where, like you said, everyone on things are happening, yet you'll hear most analysts say, the Fed will do this and that, and somehow it'll be okay. What I'd point out is that early on when I started studying precious metals, again, I was working for a trading company, and as I was seeing, really just having this put in perspective, I remember the day I talked to my boss and I was talking about these things where gold, silver, it really does look like this is a dangerous situation. And he just looked at me, he's like, yeah, well, that doesn't happen in the US. And pretty much anybody else in Wall Street I talked to said the same thing. And I guess for a while, when you have the world's reserve currency, you can delay it from happening. But I guess in terms of a specific asset class, I'm blown away by how much paper metal there is versus physical metal. So yeah, you can keep adding all the paper you want, whether it's the dollars that are added. And some folks wonder what is the price of gold to silver really, what does it matter what the Fed does? Well, it's just a simple fraction. It's dollars per ounce. So if you're increasing the dollars faster than the ounces are increasing, and then of course we have COMEX contracts, EFPs, God knows what else, forms of synthetic metal. So these things go on for as long as they do, similar to if, I know you had our friend Dave Kranzler on a week or two ago, and he was writing about these things with mortgage markets before it happened, and you weren't wrong in 2005. You were just early, and I think the movie The Big Short really puts it in perspective, and imagine part 2 playing out right now. And I don't think it has to be the scary nightmare that a lot of it is phrased as, each in our own individual way, whatever that is. If you know the car is going to go through the road at this exact moment, then you can wait a minute, make preparations, which again, it's nice that folks like you are broadcasting shows and helping people do that, because I think it's needed right now.
Right. I do agree. Thank you. And so right now, I can't help but follow and pay attention to closely the words that comes out of Jerome Powell's mouth. And he talks a lot about, this economic expansion, and the Fed's, the Fed's role, if he might have said, the Fed's role is to keep this expansion going. And so I'm thinking what happened to the regular business cycle model of booms, busts? You have your points of expansion, but then for the sake of not letting things create bubbles, you got to let them correct or whatnot. But yet they've seemed bent on keeping this thing going. And so do you think he's aware that if he decides to ease off the stimulus or ease off the gas, that this thing will come to a complete halt, a crash, or an adjustment, or what, in your opinion?
Well, I guess my first question is, where is the expansion? We still have the QE packages on there that were sold as temporary, and I don't think they're going anywhere. Interest rates still, they can't even get it past 2.5%. Mortgage market is tumbling. We saw what happened when they raised, point and a half to the stock market last year. So I'm not sure where the expansion is. And if there is an expansion, then why is it necessary to keep rates so low? Why are they talking about lowering them again? Why is the president, who's sitting there championing a stock market that he called a bubble while he was campaigning?
Yeah.
I mean,
That is amazing. So I assume he's going to take ownership if that thing corrects as well, you think? Or will he point the blame and go back to the prior administration and all the other administrations, or what?
I think it's going to be darn fascinating to see, and I'll put this in the bucket of things that I cannot in any way prove, although just wonder about. Sure seemed odd that at the same time he was calling for not a 0.25% cut. Trump wants he wants 1% all at once. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could just go to -5 straight off the bat. But really, we hadn't heard much about the trade war, and then at the same time he wants 1% cut. It's trade war ratchet up with China. Now India, Mexico by the day. Fascinating, certainly as the largest silver producer. And then back to Trump and Powell. Powell's talking about, you have all the different governors out talking about it. It's interesting, the timing, because if maybe markets crash now, you still have a year and a half to go. That's a lot of time to print a lot of money. So I know some folks think Trump cares only about the stock market, and that may well be true. I mean, if you really want to make it theatrical, and this guy's like a television showbiz personality, at least the idea that it could crash, bring in the printed money, and look at how we saved it. Look at how we recovered. Look how the Fed saved the day. Although that's a possibility, I also wonder if China, Russia, and all these other things that are happening where people are not thinking about leaving the dollar. Countries are doing it. I just got a message from a friend of mine who's moving back to Saudi Arabia. It was interesting. We were talking about how people are leaving the U.S., which it's almost like in stealth mode, but there's a ton of people that are graduating college in debt or worked 5 or 10 years in a career, realizing things aren't quite what they were sold, and they're going to drive Uber and can't pay rent. And, here's another friend who's going back, and she's like, wow, it'll be this much easier in Saudi Arabia.
Now, and so you mentioned people are feeling it. And, I think the reality is starting to set in, as you just mentioned, that it's the whole idea that the economy is not as good as the mainstream media would like for us to believe. I'm hearing more and more about student debt, I believe. Bernie Sanders gave a presentation in front of down in D.C. talking about forgiving debt. And so he had 3 or 4 people speaking in front of him, and they all told their story as to how they need a jubilee. They need some type of debt forgiveness because they were sold this big lie. And my thought is, no one forced you to sign your name on a dotted line to take out debt for an education. It's unfortunate that we were all duped into believing that that was what we needed to just achieve success, whatever that means. But yet, what are your thoughts on this whole debt jubilee from student loans? And, will this, do you think this next go around they're going to forgive the debt, or what? Would the whole college paradigm model change in general, or what? What's your thoughts on that?
I did catch that. My thoughts are it reminds me a lot of the U.S. debt, where probably a lot of it is not going to be paid back. I can see both sides of it. I think it's unfortunate the way we've been herded like sheep. I grew up in New Jersey knowing get good grades, go to college, get job. I didn't, ever the idea of doing something entrepreneurial, I don't really remember being exposed to much in that culture. And every once in a while, someone who's a bit younger than me asks about, do I recommend going to get an MBA? And I certainly wouldn't. I think it's fantastic. YouTube, YouTube's free. There you go. And you can get a variety of experts who've actually done stuff, succeeded at it. You can find the one that really resonates with you or you agree with on any subject. So, it's the student loan bubble, the corporate debt bubble, the junk bond bubble. That's why I think it's important to rethink what you think of the dollar, what you've been told about the dollar, because there's simply not enough to go around. What was that? Maybe it was one of Mike Maloney's video where they started talking about how if you begin with $100 and there's interest, where does the interest come from?
Yeah.
So it's always growing. That's why I don't think the Fed, I think they'll pretend at times like, oh, maybe we're going to raise rates next month, but not today. No. But in the end, they can't raise rates. The whole thing you saw what happened. It's not an accident that subprime began collapsing when it did. In fact, I think, just to put it in perspective, I think it was 2006, Greenspan did his last rate hike. I think it was to 5.25%. And, that's when you began seeing trouble build here. I mean, we're at 2.5 going lower. It's not exactly as if Paul Volcker is coming back in to save the day, but you can't have 20% interest rates because of what happens to all these mortgages. I mean, isn't that the biggest chunk of our economy?
Yeah.
And
it's definitely problematic. And one of my concerns is that a good portion of the population, and so a lot of the videos I've done in the past have to do with the baby boomers, those that have basically enjoyed what we consider the good times in this country, of being able to work, save, invest, and put forth their best effort with the expectation of one day being able to withdraw. And so we're reaching a point where it's going to be hard to withdraw, or as in Alan Greenspan mentioned, that they can guarantee payouts, but they can't guarantee what they'll pay. And so, for those that are in the system now, a little bit older, what are your thoughts towards information we're sharing towards them? Those that are actually expecting to retire now or currently enjoying retirement, will it last long? And what kind of information would you share with them?
Well, really that, again, each person's going to be different. I'm not a legalized financial paperwork guy, so I think there's real risk to a lot of what we know as fixed income, what a lot of people are counting on. And I don't say that to alarm someone. Maybe if that wakes someone up about something, then that's okay, and that's the reason why, again, I think it's good that people are talking about gold and silver. I think there are cryptos that are going to be part of what we're doing, and this is by no means an advertisement to say put cryptos into your retirement fund. I think some of them will go up and change the way we do a lot of things. I think they're going to be incredibly volatile. I think gold and silver on the ride up are going to be incredibly volatile, but realizing that we're in a system with a government that does not have the money to pay. So at some point, as certainly as Bernie Madoff eventually ran out of money, interestingly, as interest rates were rising, there's another reason why I don't think the Fed can raise rates, because that kind of brings it to a head. Thinking about what you're counting on, and if you have money saved, then looking into alternatives rather than just dollars or treasuries, because Main Street, Wall Street, safe haven is, in my opinion, the opposite of safe. And again, I think what's nice is that, the facts are there. You can see it. And rather than being steamrolled like in 2008, looking at there are a lot of commodities that seem darn cheap to me now. And certainly, just one thing I recommend for folks that I'm slowly implementing myself is just being outside. Maybe you start growing a garden, or just learning to diversify, whether some people like prepping or, and just, again, sharing what you learn with others. I find a lot of people feel very alone, and like there's no one else seeing this out there, but there are meetup groups or different events that are going on in whatever city you're in, and just connecting with other people. So that way, you can find whatever the right adjustments to make, but accepting that, our government has sold us a promise that I don't see how they can deliver on, and just being aware of that and putting that to your advantage, and subscribing to Rethinking the Dollar too.
I appreciate that.
Obviously the answer.
Good one there. Appreciate that. Now, looking ahead to the future, one thing that I'm often mindful of is, what's next? We know the problems. We know that the Federal Reserve note can only go so far, and ultimately monetary policy, once it's all said and done, will result in currency returning to its intrinsic value of zero, according to every other currency that's been in the same predicament. And so what would life look like after the Federal Reserve note, domestically, but more so in an international stage, because gold now is getting a bid, and we know the reserve banks around the world are accumulating gold. And so obviously there's plans of implementing it in some form or fashion. What do you think the next international primary medium of exchange will be? Will it be gold, or some type of digitally attached gold-based currency, or what are your thoughts on that?
My best guess is some mix of blockchain, perhaps could be backed by gold, perhaps backed by other commodities. I know there's two schools of thought of whether China is going to back the yuan with gold. I sure would love to know. I'd love to be in one of their board meetings and find out what they're really planning. I think in a good way, though, there's going to be a competition of currencies, which letting the market sort these things out rather than the Federal Reserve or U.S. White House. I think people will barter a lot more. In fact, I found it interesting in Greece a couple of years back when they were struggling with the euro. I saw a video that I actually visited the town when I lived there a year later about how they couldn't afford the euro, so they developed their own local currency called the TEM. And, one person was selling dancing lessons and somebody else baked bread. So, I think there certainly gold, silver, and cryptos for the folks who are investing and wondering. I mean, that's the primary of what I am in. Certainly, I think there's a risk to any sort of paper asset because we hear about how these shares are rehypothecated. So making sure that things are secured, perhaps non-financial on the other side of the dollar. Maybe this is, wishful optimistic thinking. You can decide for yourself, but we've lost about 95 to 99% of the purchasing power of the dollar just since the Fed was created alone. I mean, if we're getting like 1% of your actual contribution, imagine if the banks just took a little haircut back to 90%. You're even getting moved back to a tenth of what people are really contributing. Imagine every single parent who's working 2 or 3 jobs just to take care of the family and, it'd probably be a little less stressed with an extra zero. You have more time to actually spend with your children. It's like almost if we were using pet rocks, we'd have to be better off than the current dollar system. And I think it's unfortunate that it is used as a means of control in some ways that are disturbing at times. But, instead of all of these tanks and wars and everything, imagine, because the dollar is the last plug to that. You don't get to do that without the dollar.
Yeah, I do agree. Now, as we draw towards the end of our conversation, I'm curious to get your thoughts because you hinted at cryptocurrencies. And so I also am of the mindset that it will be utilized as a backdoor out of this old monetary system. And then whatever the next monetary unit will be, it's going to probably be blockchain, cryptocurrency based. Now it'll just be a matter of who issues it. And is it a one world type of ordeal, or is it individual sovereign governments or central banks doing the issuing? But what are your thoughts on this Facebook Libra? Is this going to be the start of an attempt to get a single currency around the world, utilizing social media?
Well, I'll say all of the above. I'm sure every scammer out there will come up with a crypto. I'm sure central banks will come up with a crypto. And again, I'm guessing that a lot of them will not survive. In terms of Libra, I am not a coder, so I can only comment from what I read and listen to. I think certainly from the overall crypto standpoint, that would seem to be a darn big step of adoption to me. Just that, similar, if you have a sign in Starbucks one day that says we accept Bitcoin or we accept Litecoin, and some start using it. If you have a price run up while it's in Starbucks, the potential for some powerful self-fulfilling advertising there. With Libra, again, take this as you will. I couldn't tell you the code from a potato. I have heard people compare it to Ripple, which is AKA the bankster's coin, and one that may or may not be accurate. I steer clear from. And certainly, I know there's some folks who get a little anxious about Facebook and what they do with data. And I didn't listen to Mark Zuckerberg's court hearing. I hear there's stuff that's maybe not so great in there. So that's my thought on that one in particular. But again, from a bigger standpoint, I think we're seeing, the world is realizing, forget about cryptos or the pricing, but a technology that prevents missing Department of Defense money, prevents however much fraud goes into Medicare and Medicaid and all these black holes. So that's what I think is exciting about the technology and has the potential to do and really make life easier. I don't think it's supposed to be this difficult, but you have so much of it being stolen, and be careful. Yes, there will be a lot of them out there. I don't know, maybe the Fed will create one, but if people are still using Bitcoin, could be that point where people just stop caring what the Fed says because it won't matter.
Right. Well, I do agree. And so I think one of the benefits, that's initially offered is the transparency aspect of the blockchain that kind of makes it a little bit easier to see and what's going on in regards to exchanges of funds. But then again, you're going to have the issues where on the personal side, no one really wants to have their own personal funds being able to be tracked on the ledger. So you have from government standpoint, it's worth the public's interest to know what's going on. But from the personal standpoint, we need a little bit of privacy and have a little bit of anonymity to our own personal dealings. So I think all that stuff is going to be ironed out in the days ahead. But Chris Marcus, I appreciate you sitting down with us on Rethinking the Dollar. For those that may not know where to find you at, can you give them a little bit of information about you and how they can keep in contact with you and be a blessing to your work?
Sure. Again, appreciate you having me on here. And I publish articles, interviews, videos I do on ArcadiaEconomics.com. When I left Wall Street, I used to walk through that Occupy Wall Street, see the frustration, and understandably, and wanted to at least provide the information that after career in trading and researching what's going on since then, that if people want information that's accurate. Yeah, and again, it doesn't have to be a scary thing once you know what's coming, and that's what I help folks do.